Hello and welcome to our online worship experience. If this is your first time tuning in, my name is Joel Pesmino. I'm the lead pastor of Encounter Church, and we're really glad that you're joining us today. Listen, before we get started with the service, just a couple things. One is we would love to connect with all of you. So if you're watching this during our live premiere on Sunday mornings, we actually have a chat going on. So if you want to go on the chat, just type in your name, where you're at, who you're watching with, and somebody from our team would love to say hi to you and connect. The other thing is that you actually can help us connect with more people and get the word out about the church. Maybe you've wanted to invite friends to church. And the good thing about online church right now is that it's incredibly easy. All you have to do is hit the share button on this video. That way it pushes to your social media timeline and maybe invites more people to join us today. We're going to have our service. We'll sing a song, and then we'll listen to a sermon. And then after that, we're going to celebrate communion. We do this every weekend. And if you would like to participate in communion, what I want to invite you to do is just get some elements ready. Get something to represent the blood of Christ. Usually it's wine or grape juice, and then something to represent the body of Christ. Maybe a piece of bread or a cracker. And you want to maybe pause this video, get that ready, so when the communion time comes, you can participate with us. And with that, let's worship today.
Good morning, Encounter. We're so glad that you're here. We're going to start the morning off by singing a song called Land of the Living. And basically what that means is that we are going to see God's goodness this side of heaven. That no matter how awful things are, that God will fulfill his promises here while we are here. So let's sing together. Let's celebrate that we can trust our God, and he stands firm to his promises that he has made to us right here, right now.
Lord, every dream and all I've hoped for, the promises you've spoken over me, I hold in faith, they're not forgotten, in spite of what I feel and what I see. And I'm choosing to believe. And your word's enough for me. I'm confident of this, that I will see your goodness in the land of the living. In the land of the living, one thing will never change. One hope is in your name, because you are living, because you are living. Oh, because you are living, we can trust your word. You are creator and redeemer. You take the broken things and make them new. So while you're working and while I'm waiting, I will lift a song and sing my praise to you. I will lift a song and sing my praise to you. I'm confident of this, that I will see your goodness in the land of the living. In the land of the living, one thing will never change. My hope is in your name, because you are living, because you are living. Because you are living, yes you are, Lord. never made a promise you couldn't keep. 'Cause you don't lie to me. You don't lie to me. Oh, you never made a promise you couldn't keep. 'Cause you don't lie to me. You don't lie to me. Yeah, you never made a promise you couldn't keep. 'Cause you don't lie to me. You don't lie to me. Sing, you never made a promise you couldn't keep. 'Cause you don't lie to me. You don't lie to me. Oh, I'm confident of this, that I will see your goodness in the land of the living, in the land of the living. One thing will never change. My hope is in your name, because you are living, because you are living. I'm confident of this, that I will see your goodness in the land of the living, in the land of the living. One thing will never change. My hope is in your name, because you are living, 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 because you are living.
Welcome back. If this is your first time tuning in, we would love to connect with you. We have a form on our website. We call it like a digital connection card. And it's just a form that you can go in, just put in as little or as much information as you're comfortable with. It's a way for us to know that you visited us, but it's also a way for you to connect with us. If you have questions about the church, or if there's any way in which we can, pray for you or serve you, that's the best way to get in touch with us. In the description of this video, there should be a link with it, or you can go to encounterdc.com/connect to find the digital connection card. We like to do a couple things when we get one of those. When we get a first-time connection card, we set aside some money that we then donate to one of our partner organizations in our community that are doing good. So by filling out a card, you're actually helping serve this community. The other thing is that we have a small gift for you. So if you fill out one of those cards, somebody from our team will be in touch, and we want to say thank you for visiting us today. Before we start with the sermon, I just have one big announcement. Today, September 27th, is our first outdoor worship service, and it's also our anniversary party. Encounter turned 3 years old a couple weeks ago on September 10th, and we are celebrating today on the back deck of Sony's Pizza at 4 p.m. It's going to be a blast. It's going to be a ton of fun. We're going to have live worship. We're going to have live teaching, and we're going to celebrate eating some pizza. So we would love for you to be a part of that. On the events section of our website, there's all the information that you need, the directions and everything for that. But please, I would love for you to come out today, get to say hi, and celebrate with you. And now, let's listen to the sermon. On May 21st of 1940, the Allied forces of the British Expeditionary Force and part of the Belgian army and part of the French army, they find themselves closed in by the German army along the northern beaches of France in the region of Dunkirk. And basically, they've been fighting this battle for many days, and they're losing, and they're basically kind of like with their walls, with their backs literally against the ocean, about to be destroyed. And, they request an evacuation, and, the Vice Admiral of the Royal Navy, he orders an evacuation, sends his big destroyer ships to carry them away. The problem is that the docks of Dunkirk, which is the place where the ships will come in, those are being destroyed because of the war. The only place they can use to escape is this mall that's kind of like along one of the sides of the harbor, and they cannot do it fast enough. So they cannot load soldiers on the big ships fast enough. So some of the other big ships are kind of like outside. They're sending these smaller vessels to pick up some soldiers and kind of like ferry them into the big ship. And as they're doing this, they realize they're not going to have enough time to do it. They need more vessels. So what the admiral running this operation does is that he starts recruiting every single small ship or vessel that he can find. So he picks up fishing boats and lifeboats and anything that he can find that's small, that's willing to come and help. He recruits them, and these boats come, and they are the ones that start like ferrying the soldiers back and forth from the beaches of Dunkirk into the large destroyer ships that are taking the soldiers away. These little ships end up rescuing about 98,000 people, which is like a third of all the troops that get rescued. They're now known as the little ships of Dunkirk, and they're kind of like legendary. Christopher Nolan did a movie about this a couple of years ago. And it's a fascinating story because I think that it echoes moments in your lives where we find ourselves that we had a plan, and we knew where we wanted to go, and we know what we wanted to do, and everything kind of like seems like it starts going wrong. And we find ourselves kind of like with our backs maybe against the wall, hopefully not against the ocean, and we don't know what to do. And part of what we see in the story is somebody improvising and changing plans in order to push ahead with the vision. This moment is critical in World War II. Because some historians believe that if the German troops had just kept fighting, they would have basically severely crippled the Allied efforts to the point that maybe they would have won the war. And other historians also believe that this was kind of like the moment that fueled hope into the Allied forces, that they could stand up to the German armies and defeat them. This is kind of like a pivotal moment in the history of the war. I'm telling you this because today we're looking at a story in the book of Nehemiah, when as the people of Israel are rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, they come to a point where they face opposition, where they had a vision of where they wanted things to go, and things end up not going that way. And the question is, what do you do in those moments? What do you do when you had a vision and it seems like it's not going to pass, and you have to improvise and you have to change? So, if you have a Bible, open it in the book of Nehemiah on chapter 4, or you can follow along on the screen. This is why it says Nehemiah chapter 4, starting on verse 1. When Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What are they building? Even a fox climbing up on it would break down their wall of stones." Nehemiah, as we've been reading this story, has this vision from God to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And we've seen him have favor from God at every step of the way. He prays for 4 months, and he goes before the king of the Persian Empire and just tells him, I need to go to Jerusalem to rebuild this wall. I need you to pay for the whole expedition and to give me permission for like 12 years to take care of this. And I need you to give me all the lumber that I need. And by the way, I need you to send me bodyguards and give me letters of authorization so like everybody would help me out. And he gets it. And then he gets to Jerusalem and he looks around at the work and he gathers the people of Jerusalem that are there and casts his vision to rebuild the wall. And everybody's in and everybody says, "Yes, you're right, let's do it." And they come together. And last week we looked at how all of these different families all got to work and started rebuilding the wall of Jerusalem. Up until this point, everything has been going great. And honestly, isn't that how we would love for rebuilding to go? right? We've suffered. Rebuilding is not building for the first time. It's building after something has changed. We're using this story, this book, kind of like to reflect on the time in which we're living, in which for many of us, it feels like we're rebuilding elements of our life. Maybe it's our career that drastically changed in light of COVID. Maybe it's like our family life and dynamics are so different now that, children are learning at home and we're working from home. Maybe relationships in our lives change because of this. And we're all kind of like trying to figure this out. As a church, we're also thinking through this time that in many ways it feels like we're rebuilding our church, like learning what does it mean to be the church and this time when we're not meeting together on Sundays, but we're trying to start doing things and we're having, outdoor worship services and life groups in person. What does it mean to rebuild our life and identity and community of a church at this time? And it's great when everything goes according to plan. It's great when everything goes the way in which we envision. But what happens when we hit opposition or when we hit roadblocks? And this is what's happening right now. Because, Nehemiah it's starting to rebuild the wall and everything is great. And all of a sudden, he faces opposition. These 3 men that are, important leaders of the neighboring regions, they don't like seeing the people of Israel do well. They benefit from the people of Israel being vulnerable. And all of a sudden, they're worried now. And what they're doing is that they're mocking the people of Israel and trying to get in the way of the work. And, hopefully you're not facing that kind of opposition of neighboring, countries or cities are coming to you and accusing you of things and trying to get you killed and whatnot. But we face things when we're trying to rebuild stuff. Maybe, the funding that you were expecting for the business falls through. Or the people you thought that were going to help you with the thing that you were going to do, they leave. And there are difficulties that you didn't even plan for or consider, and they start happening. And maybe you're starting to see like the first results of the work that you're doing, and they don't look like what you had envisioned originally. What happens, when it looks like the vision that God has given us to rebuild starts dying even before it begins to take fruition? So what I want to do today is take a look at how Nehemiah reacts in the midst of this and maybe see what we can learn from that. So let's keep reading. This is verse 4. Hear us, O God, this is Nehemiah speaking, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight. For they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. So, what does Nehemiah do in the face of opposition? The first thing that he does is he turns to God in prayer. That's his first instinct. And I'll be honest with you, that's not my first instinct when I face adversity. When I face adversity, my first instinct is to freak out. I remember just yesterday, we're trying to, secure a place for one of our outdoor meetings, and we had kind of like agreed on how things were going to go. And I get an email just as I'm recording, and in the email, the guy says basically, listen, there's this change, and all I could think about for the remainder of the time that I'm trying to record a sermon and preach is that email that I got, and I have to deal with it and what's going to happen. And end up being nothing, end up working itself out perfectly fine. But that's my mind. When something bad happens, I immediately freak out and start thinking, okay, this is over and it's worst case scenario. And it's fascinating because Nehemiah is this type A, very driven guy that's always prone to action. And yet, throughout the whole book, what we see is that in the face of problems or difficulties or whatever circumstance, his first instinct is always to pray. We see this on chapter 1 when he hears for the first time, the news about how the city is in ruins. His first instinct is to turn to God. Why is that? Well, I think that Nehemiah understands something about prayer. And that is that prayer is the fuel of vision. Prayer changes Nehemiah's focus from what's going on around him and whatever the situation is and whatever adversity he's facing, and he kind of changes that focus to God. Because whenever we face adversity, there's two things going on. One is, well, the actual adversity, right? Whatever the problem, whatever the opposition, whatever the obstacle, you have to deal with it. But when you're carrying out a vision that you believe God has given you, something that you believe God is calling you to do, there's a second thing that happens when an obstacle comes out. And that is that you start doubting yourself. And you start doubting that it was God the one who called you to this. And you start doubting that you're even supposed to be doing this in the first place. And you start kind of like just playing yourself this tape of like, well, what if this was just my imagination? What if I'm the one that wanted to do this, but God was never in this in the first place? I remember when I started training to become a church planter, I went to this 9-month training camp. And one of the first things they told us was, if there's anything else that you can do with your life, do that instead of planting a church. And this is a training for church planters, right? So they want you to become a church planter. But the reason why they would say that is because they had understood that, planting a church is a very, very difficult thing. And when you face adversity and when you face opposition or you face obstacles, if you are not 100% in believing that God has called you to do this, your very first thinking is going to be to flee or to quit or to go do something else, because you start doubting yourself. So they're trying to create this resilience in you, this confidence that, no, it's God the one who's called me to this, that you have to be absolutely sure of that. And what prayer does is that when we are in this constant relationship with God, when we're constantly hearing from God and bearing our heart out to God, there is this cycle that's feeding into us vision and encouragement and reassurance that God is with us. We're reminded of God's love and God's faithfulness, and we're reminded of the call that God has on our lives. And we need this in order to sustain us through adversity. When we're rebuilding something on the foundation of God, we talked about last week, but we're not just rebuilding for ourselves. It's not just for our own self-interest, but it's actually because we want to be part of the larger thing that God is doing in the world. When we're rebuilding for God's kingdom with a vision beyond ourselves, that also means that it's going to take God's intervention for things to work out. If you remember last week, I mentioned the phrase I heard John Tyson preaching a sermon on Nehemiah years ago, that he said, God will rarely do for you what he wants to do through you. And the idea of that phrase is that, God is calling us into action and into work and to take steps of faith. But listen to the phrase. God will really do for you what he wants to do through you. In both cases, God is the one ultimately doing the thing. Even when we take steps of faith, even when we take action, even when we do things, God is the one that's behind us doing things through us. That's why the psalmist says, unless the Lord builds a house, the builders labor in vain. Prayer reminds us that it is the Lord, the one who is building the house. And when we're reminded of that, then we are encouraged and empowered to keep moving forward in the face of adversity, which is what we see next in this chapter. So we keep reading verse 6. So we rebuild the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs to Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, they were very angry. They all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Meanwhile, the people in Judah had said, the strength of the laborers is giving out and there is so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Also, our enemy said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and will kill them and put an end to the work. Then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack us. Therefore, I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. When our enemies heard that we were aware of their plot and that God had frustrated, we all returned to the wall, each to our own work. So Nehemiah kind of like turns to God, and have you ever noticed that problems don't come one at a time? That a lot of times when one thing goes wrong, 7 things go wrong at the same time. And this is what happens here, right? Like it starts with just these 3 guys that are opposing them. And before you know them, there's like, they can't keep the work because they're exhausted and there's too much rubble, so they can't even they don't have enough room to actually rebuild the wall. And all of a sudden, there's all these people that are trying to gather and attack them and kill everybody. It's like the perfect storm of bad things happening. And what's fascinating is that because Nehemiah has first turned to God in prayer, because the first thing that Nehemiah has done is to seek God, and because Nehemiah has this assurance that God is with him, all these problems are kind of like coming his way, and he just moves forward. But he's not moving forward on his own strength. He's acting in faith. There's this line, right, in kind of like in the middle of this, on verse 14, he says, he's talking to the people of Israel, he says, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your son and your daughters, your wives and your homes. There's this connection that Nehemiah makes between remembering the Lord, because knowing that God is with you. And the only way that he gets to that is because he's been seeking God in prayer and being able to face adversity head on in the midst of the number of things that come his way. About 8 months into the life of Encounter, after we planted the church, the only place that we had been able to find was this big theater on 14th Street, that some of you know, the Gala Theater, and it was way too big for us. That's the only place that we had been able to find to launch. And about 10 months in, we realized, okay, this is killing us physically, because set up and tear down for that place was really difficult and hard, and it was just a few of us. And so one day I just came and gathered everybody from leadership team and say, guys, I really feel like we need to move. We need to find a new place to meet. And everybody's like, yeah, you know what? I think you're right. And I talked to, the person who was holding the lease, and they were like very flexible, understood, and let us kind of like, we only had to pay a small penalty, and they let us off our lease. And we're kind of like trying to find a place. We ended up finding a small, used to be a Tex-Mex restaurant right next door called El Tío. Some of you are familiar with it, and we met for a summer there. But in the midst of that process, right, as we were moving to El Tío, a lot of the initial people that had kind of like helped us form the church, they had to step down off the team for a number of reasons. It wasn't anything like particularly against me or anything like that. It was like, hey, we were living like really, really far away, and I'm starting school, and I just don't have the time to do this. A family actually, they were transferred for their job somewhere else. And it was like, in about like 2 months, I remember like most of our worship team had kind of like evaporated. And it were also the people that were helping us get, set up and tear down, and were some of our big givers. And I found myself at this moment, like, I don't know how we're going to make it through. Like, it's a lot of things coming at me at the same time. And usually problems happen like that. And, I remember at some point, getting to a point I was praying before God. I was like, listen, if you're with us, something's going to have to happen. You're going to have to do something beyond what we can do to move forward. And in the midst of that is how God kind of like opened the doors for us to move to the space that we're in right now on 11th Street. And God started bringing people into our lives, into our journey. God connected us to Guest Worship that kind of helped us with our worship team. Like, all of those things started happening, right at the same time as all these adversities and bad news started coming our way. It was like, and listen, ever since then, every time we've like faced adversity or I've heard some sort of bad news, I remember that. I remember, like, listen, when we were at the moment that I wasn't sure if the church was going to make it, God took care of us. And God sent the people we needed, and God connected us with people, and God opened doors for us that we didn't even know existed. And it's that faith. What Nehemiah is talking about here, remember the Lord who is great and awesome. When I remember what God has done for us, I'm able to keep moving forward. And that's what it means to act in faith. So let's continue. Verse 16. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, and bows and armor. The officers posted themselves behind all the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work with one hand and held a weapon in the other, and each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. But the man who sounded the trumpet stayed with me. And then I said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, the work is extensive and spread out, and we're widely separated from each other along the wall. Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, join us there. Our God will fight for us. So we continued the work with half the men holding spears from the first light of dawn till the stars came out. At that time, I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. Neither I, nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off their clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. So what we see here is that all of a sudden Nehemiah has to adapt. Like he has to change in light of adversity. Like instead of having everybody working to finish the wall at a certain time, which was his original vision, now it's taking longer because there's only half the people working on the wall because half the people are kind of like standing guard to protect the workers. Like he didn't probably originally realize, I'm going to have to organize like a defense army against this. And now he has to, right? And this is the thing, when we face adversity, we need to have flexibility because things in the real world rarely go the way that we imagine them to go, don't they? This is a place where vision meets reality. You know, I remember in planting a church, I was like, I thought we were going to accomplish these things with this group of people. And then they leave, and there's a new group of people. And, you know, I thought we were going to meet in this building, but it ends up being that we're meeting in a different building. Maybe for you, like, you think, okay, I thought this thing was going to go this way, and it ends up going this way. I thought I was going to be working at this place, and I get there, and I realize I hate this job, and I take a new job. Like a lot of times we have this vision for rebuilding, and when we start actually putting it into practice, we realize things look different, and we have to learn to change and be flexible, right? And this thing, depending on how we handle that flexibility, that change, you know, we're able to maybe embrace that process easily. But a lot of times that process can feel like a death. And the reason why is that when we have a vision, we hold on tight to how we think things are supposed to happen. And when trouble comes, then it feels like things are, crumbling down and everything that we dreamed of is kind of like falling apart. And in order to have flexibility, in order to be able to change in the light of adversity, we have to come to a realization that Nehemiah came to. On verse 20, after he says to the people that are building the wall, hey, when you hear the trumpet, come join us to fight. He says this line, he says, our God will fight for us. You know what's interesting? Because just a few verses before, he says, remember the Lord and fight. He's going to remember the Lord and you fight too. Even though they're fighting, our God is the one who's going to fight. What's happening there? Nehemiah gets to a point where he realizes that all this that he's doing, this battle that he has to fight, but, the rebuilding of the wall, the whole enterprise that he's kind of like giving his life to, it's ultimately not his. It's God's. It's not ultimately his responsibility. It's ultimately God's responsibility. The one who will have ultimate success over this is not him. It's God. It's not his work. It's God's work that he gets to join in. And flexibility in the midst of adversity only will happen when we've achieved a healthy detachment from what we're doing. And when I say detachment, I don't mean like we are apathetic or that we give up on whatever we're doing. I mean what Nehemiah is doing. Nehemiah is saying at a point, okay, this is ultimately not about me. It's about God. And the reason why that is important is because a lot of times our identities get tangled up with the vision that we have and with our work and with our ideas of success very easily. So if things are going great, well, that's awesome. We feel great, right? Because if things are going great, that means I'm great. and if things are going wrong, it crushes us. Because if something is going wrong, that means that I'm wrong. I think a couple of weeks ago when Kenny was preaching the last sermon of The Church We Can Be Serious, he had this idea. He says like that he's afraid sometimes that if he was to be super generous with the resources of his church and the church were to fail, that somehow would mean that he failed. By the way, that feeling is not alone to him. Every single pastor has that feeling. If something happens to church, is your failure. Maybe you have that feeling about a business that you're starting, or your career, or a relationship, that if something goes wrong, if something doesn't go the way you want it to, the way you envision it to go, it speaks negatively about you. And that feeling can be crushing when things go wrong. And what gets Nehemiah past that is this attachment. My identity is not tied to the success or failure of this enterprise. This is ultimately God's. And I'm just a servant carrying out a task. But my identity, my love, who I am, that's in God. It stops us from being kind of like saying it has to be this way, because we stop being afraid of failure in a way, because it's not connected to our identity anymore. And the thing is that vision is a little bit more ambiguous than we realize. Well, remember that we've talked about this idea of like praying and seeking God and asking for a vision for a future, but let me give you a caveat to that. And it's that a lot of times the vision that we have is not fully the vision that God has. Not because God doesn't want to share the vision with us. A lot of times we don't hear it the right way because we cannot fully understand God's ways. There's a pastor in Colorado that I listen to, like him a lot. His name is Andrew Arndt. And I heard him say this once. He says, discipleship, he says, is not following an abstraction known as the future. It is following Jesus. And the hard part of discipleship for me has been learning to live in the gifts God has given me, standing in the future and reporting back from their chief among those, talking about vision. He says, well, at the same time, holding my idea of the future loosely enough to realize that in his heart a man plans his course, but the Lord determines where he steps. My gifts may glimpse the future in some or another aspect, but it is obedience to the Lord that takes us into the future that he actually is dreaming, rather than the one dimly perceived by imaginations clouded as much by ambition and fear as they are by faith. What Andrew is saying is that a lot of times, the vision that God gives us, it gets tangled up with our insecurities and with our ambition. For pastors, it's very easily, right? Because you feel this call that God is calling you to preach and to teach and to share the gospel with people. But usually when you close your eyes and imagine that, well, you are the guy on a stage and you have the microphone and the lights are on you. It's very appealing to our egos. And that gets tangled up with the clarity of the vision for what God is calling us to do. And the secret is to realize that we ultimately don't follow vision, we follow God. And that means that there might be times where we'll have to change the course of things that we were doing. Sometimes that's going to mean changing things, changing the way we do things, changing the way we imagine things we're going to go. Sometimes that might mean walking away from things. Not everything that we try to rebuild a lot of times is going to work out. Things change, things die. And I hope you know that. I hope that you see that rebuilding, it's a lifelong process. You might start a business and it might not work out. Because sometimes businesses don't work out. You might start a relationship, it might not work out because sometimes relationships don't work out. You might start a career or a job and it might not work out because sometimes careers and jobs don't work out. And you have to learn to detach whatever happens in there with your identity and your relationship with God and be willing to rebuild again. And keep following God. Keep following Jesus. And that's probably one of the hardest parts of the journey of being alive. And sometimes it does feel like a death of our dreams, of our hopes. Sometimes what happens is we get to the point that it dawned on us that this thing that we wanted to do, this thing that we thought we were able to do, that we can't do it. And this is the thing, that's a place where God meets us. At the beginning of this passage, one of the people that are opposing the building says this. He says, what are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble burned as they are? Can they bring these stones back to life? You know, that passage reminds me of another passage, one of the prophecies in the book of Ezekiel, that says this. Ezekiel chapter 37, verse 1, it says, the hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, Son of man, can these bones live? I said, Sovereign Lord, you alone know. Years before the events in Nehemiah, the prophet Ezekiel gets his vision from God. And, in this vision, he looks at this valley that's full of dry bones. And God asks him in this vision, can these bones come back to life? And that's meant to represent the life of Israel coming back, right? And the bones start, growing like muscles and flesh, and they come back to life. And, it's this idea that one day God was going to restore the nation of Israel. And this scene that we see in Nehemiah, it's kind of like the beginning of that prophecy coming to pass. Like the question at the beginning of that chapter is not a coincidence. It's meant to sound familiar, that the bones are coming back to life, that God is keeping his promises, that God has not given up on Israel. And what does this matter? Because I think that this represents the ultimate hope that we have in the face of adversity. That there is always new life. That there is always resurrection on the other side. Maybe we're facing adversity and our rebuilding efforts, are facing all these sorts of problems, and we're asking ourselves this question: can this actually happen? Can these bones come back to life? Can these stones come back to life? And we feel like our critics and our adversaries are mocking us, asking this question: can the thing that you're trying to do even work out? You failed before. Are you going to fail again? And we have all these things. And the answer to whether these stones can come back to life in Christ is always yes. Because we serve the God of resurrection. That might mean that we're able to overcome the obstacles that we're facing, and that we might be able to press on with the rebuilding efforts of whatever the thing is that we're trying to do, and that we're going to succeed. But this is the thing, and hear me out here for a second. Even if it doesn't, even if this new dream and this new project that we have, even if this rebuilding effort for whatever it is that we're trying to do, even if that thing fails, the stones can still come back to life. You know what happens with the wall that Nehemiah rebuilds? Eventually it gets destroyed. Eventually, many years later, after Jesus' ascension, there is a rebellion in Judea against the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire comes and they level the city again. And eventually after that, the city is rebuilt, and eventually after that, the people of Israel yet again are able to come back into the land. There's whatever success, it's temporary. It's also very relative because it's temporary. But in the book of Hebrews, there is a line where the writer of Hebrews is talking about all the people in the Old Testament that had, lived by faith. And there's a line that I've always read that says that they were looking for the city that is to come, talking about Jerusalem. And then he says this: whose architect and builder is God. That the ultimate hope of Christians, the ultimate hope that we have for the future, is not a hope on temporary success. It's a hope in resurrection life. And this is the thing: resurrection life, it's not the consolation prize, it's the jackpot. Whatever fulfillment you think you might get from the success of your business or your enterprise or even like a church, that is temporary. The thing that lasts is the resurrection life that exists in Christ. And listen, you might be looking around at the heaps and rubble of your past and maybe your mistakes or maybe your failures or maybe the things that you've suffered through this time. And and looking at your broken dreams and hopes, and you ask yourself, can this come back to life? And God's still saying yes. Maybe the thing that you're trying to work out, maybe it won't. I don't know the answer to that question. But what I know is that either way, God isn't done with you. The stones can still come back to life. And that is the hope that gets us out of bed every morning. That's a hope that gets us to keep moving and keep rebuilding and keep pressing on. That when we ask God the question, can these stones live? Can these stones come back to life? Can our lives and our hopes and our dreams come back to life even when they face what seems like a death? That God's answer is always yes. Because Christ has come back to life. And that means that all of creation is coming back to life. And that means that our lives coming back to life. Grace and peace. When we talk about new life, well, new life always comes with a death, right? The reason why we believe that the stones can come back to life, that the bones can come back to life, is because Jesus came back to life. Jesus is representing the life of Israel, representing our lives, and saying that God is injecting resurrection life into the world through His Son. So when we come today when we come to partake in the elements, my encouragement to you is that you will remember that. That you, every time that it feels like things are falling apart, then how can they possibly change? But look at Jesus. Because Jesus' life has come back. Because God has resurrected His Son. And in Him, He promised that He will resurrect you. He will resurrect the real hopes and the real dreams that you have. That is life with Him. So let us pray. God, we come before you this morning and present these elements to you, asking that you would meet us in this moment. That your Holy Spirit would invade this space and our lives. And that you would remind us of the love and the hope that is only found in Jesus Christ, in His death and His resurrection, in the victory that He's obtained over death. And that when we look at our lives, God, that the hope that we have is that victory is also ours by faith in Him. In the name of your Son we pray. Amen. To take the elements, Jesus, on the night when He was betrayed, He took bread. And after giving thanks, He broke it and He told His disciples, eat it, this is my body broken for you. So just take the bread together. And after taking the bread, He took the cup, and after giving thanks, He said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, poured out for you for the forgiveness of sins. Let's take the cup. That Jesus says, every time you eat this bread and you drink this cup, you are announcing to the world the Lord's death until He comes. So we proclaim the mystery of our faith. Christ has died, Christ has risen, and Christ will come again. These are the gifts of God for the people of God.
When the mountains fall and the tempest roars, you are with me. When creation falls, still my soul will soar on your mercy. As I walk through the fire with my head lifted high and my spirit revived in your story, I'll look to the cross as my failure is lost in the light of your glorious grace. So let the ruins come to life in the beauty of your name, rising up from the ashes. God, forever you reign. And my soul will find a refuge in the shadow of your wings. I will love you forever, and forever I'll sing. The world caves in, still my hope will cling to your promise. When my courage ends, let my heart find strength in your presence. As I'll walk through the fire with my head lifted high and my spirit revived in your story. As I look to the cross, as my failure is lost in the light of your glorious grace. So let the ruins come to life in the beauty of your name. Rising up from the ashes, God, forever you reign. And my soul will find a refuge in the shadow of your wings. I will love you forever, and forever I'll sing. Sing it again. The winds come to life in the beauty of your name. Rising up from the ashes, God, forever you reign. And my soul will find a refuge in the shadow of your wings. I will love you forever, and forever I'll sing. So let the ruins come to life, the beauty of your name. Rising up from the ashes, God, forever you reign. And my soul will find a refuge, the shadow of your wings. I will love you forever, and forever I'll sing.
I want to take a moment to say thank you to all of you who faithfully support the work of Encounter with your tithes and your offerings. Your generosity makes a difference, and it helps us continue to do the work we're doing in this community. And if you are considering starting to give and joining, we want to encourage you. We consider this as much a part of our worship life as our singing or as a reading of the scriptures. Like, generosity is part of the things that God calls us into. The best way you can do this is you want to go to our website, encounterdc.com/give. There's a button you can click, and there's a form in there that you can sign up to do a one-time donation, a recurring donation, and we thank you for your generosity. One final thing before we close. Remember, today at 4 p.m. is our first outdoor worship service, and it's also our anniversary celebration. At Sonny's Pizza, 4 p.m., go to encounterdc.com/events. We have all the information, or comment on the chat and somebody will give you all the details. We hope that we get to see you tonight. And now for a word of benediction. My brothers and sisters of Encounter, may you, when you face adversity, when you face opposition, when you're trying to do something and it feels like you can't get ahead because the problems start mounting up against you, when you look at sometimes the rubble of failures and mistakes, and when you ask yourself the question, can these stones come back to life? May you know that God's answer is yes. That God in Christ has brought resurrection life into the world. And if you place your faith in Him, the resurrection life for you. Grace and peace. See you guys next week.